myth and his newest book, The Most Effective Ways to Live Longer. And that's what we're talking about today, how to live longer. Johnny, right before we went to break, we said we were going to talk about heart disease because it is the number one killer worldwide and so and in the U.S. So what's the biggest risk factor for heart disease and what can we do about it?
Oh, well, I'm so glad you asked. Because, for two reasons. One is, as I think I mentioned to you offline, I'm currently starting the research for the revised and updated version of the Great Cholesterol Myth, which will be out in January of 2021. And we are looking at all of the stuff that's come out since we wrote that bestseller, which, as you know, and it's pertinent to this discussion, claims that cholesterol is not the risk factor that we should be looking at. And that's what that book is about.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you brought that up for that reason. And the second reason I'm thrilled you brought it up is that ARP, which I'm assuming maybe there's a couple of people there that are members of ARP. I know I am. And I got my ARP magazine in the mail yesterday, and it had 7 numbers that reveal your heart disease risk. And this is what they are telling to the largest body of seniors in America, the membership of the AARP.
Okay.
And these numbers and these tests are so fakakta and so so completely missing the mark that it simply makes me crazy that this is the information that people are getting about how to lower the risk for heart disease. As I said on Dr. Oz, trying to lower the risk for heart disease by lowering your cholesterol is like trying to lower your waistline by taking the lettuce off of your double burger at McDonald's. It's just the wrong target. And when I look at these numbers that they are telling people, I say, well, cholesterol should be under 240. First of all, we shouldn't even be measuring cholesterol in the old-fashioned way with good and bad cholesterol. It's 1950s technology. It doesn't tell us anything useful. So even measuring it that way and telling them to worry about that number is sort of like telling you how to fix your cassette tape. It's just irrelevant. Number 2, their blood pressure, what they tell you your blood pressure should be 130 over 80. There isn't a decent functional medicine doctor in America who would like those numbers.
Wow.
These are average numbers that'll keep you, that more or less will keep you out of the emergency room. They have nothing to do with optimal health. Mm-hmm. You want your blood pressure on the low side, low of 120 over 80, not the high.
Right.
And then they don't even mention tests like CRP, which is a test for inflammation, which has more to do with the instigation of heart disease than almost anything you've ever heard of, certainly more than cholesterol does.
Yeah, it's crazy. Well, they make a ton of money selling statins. You know that. You wrote the book, The Great Cholesterol Myth, and I'm so excited that you're going to write an updated version of it because I have had that book in my car. I keep it in my car. It's part of my library, my standing library that I keep in my car when I do the show. Whenever we're talking about cholesterol or heart disease, I always use it as a reference tool. And I want to bring up an important part in that book about emotional well-being and the Rosetta study. So is it Rosetta? Is that it?
It's the Rosetta phenomena. Yes. You're absolutely right. It's a wonderful thing to bring up. Do we have time for me to mention 2 more of these crazy ARP things?
Absolutely.
We talk about resting heart rate being between 60 and 100. You guys have been trainers and reach 100 for a resting heart rate?
That's crazy.
Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
And then they talk about blood glucose being under 100. Now, this is a separate discussion, but when you want to talk about the number one risk for heart disease, before we get into the Rosetta phenomena and emotional health, let me tell you the number one risk for heart disease.
What is it?
It blows everything else out of the water, and it probably will take a longer discussion than we have time for, but just put it in your thinking caps. The number one risk for heart disease is diabetic physiology.
Wow.
In other words, the things that lead you to metabolic syndrome, which are high blood pressure, abdominal obesity, insulin resistance, always pops up. That's at the heart of all of the cardiometabolic diseases, from diabetes to pre-diabetes to metabolic syndrome to obesity, insulin resistance. That physiology, where you're insulin resistant, where you're storing fat around the abdomen, where your blood pressure is a little bit high, where your triglycerides are off the roof, that is the physiology that leads to heart disease, not elevated cholesterol.
Yeah.
Okay. Now let's talk about Rosetta.
Okay. Okay. Well, we have a couple of minutes. We have about 4 minutes left.
What you brought up is brilliant because it does. We've been talking about the physiological risk factors for heart disease, such as I mentioned, insulin resistance and blood glucose and all of that. We haven't been talking about the emotional ones, and I'm glad you brought that up because it is a huge factor. And the Rosetta phenomena is a wonderful way to explain it. So in the first part of the 20th century, there is this hard scrapple town in Pennsylvania called Rosetta. And these people were walking, they were an insurance underwriter's nightmare. They all smoked. They worked in the mines. I mean, the most horrible, dangerous, dust-breathing mines. They ate what was then considered the worst kind of diet possible. Now we might consider it
right.
Not so bad, but it was really junk food. They had poverty. It was a mess. They had no heart disease.
Yeah,
and no one could figure it out.
Yeah.
And it was like one of those things, like, where they spot a UFO. Everybody came to Rosetta. All the scientists would go, we got to think this does not make sense.
Mm-hmm.
How did they have, now they had heart disease, obviously, at very vanishingly low rates, nothing like what you would predict from their lifestyle. And to make a long story short, books have been written about this, by the way, to make a long story short, what they found was that the social bonds of these folks who had all come over from the old country and lived in communities where they were pretty much intact and they knew everybody and they had social things every Sunday and they ate dinner together and they went to church together and they did charity things together. The social fabric was like no one had seen in quite a long time. Well, and it was the only variable that they could account for this with.
Yeah.
Because there was just no other reason, not genetics, not smoking, not the quality of the food.
Yeah,
and that's the power of what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, and if I'm not mistaken, there was three. It's so, and it's very much like Hispanics in America now, and there was three generations typically living under one roof, and so they all supported one another. And I think it's so important the example that they set, and just the power of giving love and adding value to adding value to family, and just. That socialization, it's so important for emotional well-being.
It's amazing. I mean, you're dog lovers, we have puppies.
Oh, yeah.
You can see it. There's your laboratory for it. I mean, everything, whatever the genetics of the dog, epigenetics has so much more, how the environment acts on those genetics has so much more power than the pure genetics.
Well,
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, and that's what epigenetics is. It says, look, genes count for about 20% of what happens to you.
Absolutely.
That other 80%, man.
Well, I love your book.
Where you have the power.
I love your book. I love the revised version of it, The Most Effective Ways to Live Longer. And I can't wait for your new book of The Great Cholesterol Myth, because the first one was so outstanding. I can't even imagine how good. The second one is you're going to have to come back to talk about this AARP stuff, though, and all of the advice that they're giving out that is incorrect.
I should come on every month.
You should. Absolutely. You're in. Just say the word, Jonny. You've been on the show from the very beginning. Jill Lane is the one that introduced us, and she's a regular on the show as well. So we'd love to have you back anytime you want.
All righty. Thank you so much. Great to talk to you guys.
Great to talk to you, too. And maybe we'll see you in Austin in April at the Paleo FX.
So.
All right.
Take care.
Thank you so much. That's Jonny Bowden. His books are amazing, you guys. The Most Effective Ways to Live Longer and The Great Cholesterol Myth. A big shout out to our sponsors again. Great companies like Sun Warrior, Crazy Water, the H Hemp Company, Paleo Magazine, the Wellbeing Journal, and the International Society of Sports Nutrition. You know what? You get one body, you get one mind, and you get one life. Get out there today and make the most of it.